And who hasn't read the book would have a hard time writing an essay. I
Right.
suspect you the opposite. So it's
Yeah.
a sort of luxury to get to talk to you.
Thank you. I also like that. I feel I've been interviewing you since the Graham Greene book. So I guess
Yeah,
I was.
yes,
That's
yes,
the yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Well, and you're interviewing every other writer I can think of, right? I mean, that's
That's it. Yeah, yeah. So maybe we'll start off with where we left off, I think, which was 2 years ago with the
wonderful.
last. The book has come out fairly soon. It's been just a year since your last book came out. But also, would you say this has been the book that's been the longest in the writing? Because you've been going to this hermitage for nearly 30 years. And so can you tell us a little bit about that?
I would say it's the longest in the consideration, but not in the writing. In other words, yes, I've been going there for 34 years. I've written many short essays over the years about it, but I only actually began writing this book after I finished the last one. So the last one, at least in the US, came out exactly 2 years ago. And I see them as very much companion books, brother and sister book. As you remember, that one was traveling around the world to look at paradise. And this is about people who are sitting in one place and finding paradise, but bringing that out into the world. But the writing part was only difficult because, as you may know, I had 4,000 pages of notes because I'd been there for 34 years, and distilling that into a haiku was quite a challenge. But because it's a short book, it didn't take that long.
You have
Yes,
pages and
yes.
pages of notes. But you also say how sometimes those pages are gibberish as well, right? When you go back to them. Uh,
Yes.
so can you tell us a little bit about how do you, like you said, how did you make a haiku from 30 years of notes?
Yes. I would say that the numberless or 4,000 pages I've written there are not gibberish, but they're just too peaceful to translate to the clamorous world. They wouldn't make sense to somebody in rush hour traffic or in Mumbai or even Pune, perhaps, because they sound like somebody whispering to himself in an empty room above the clouds, because they are essentially. So everything that comes out of me there feels right and true, but I just realize it's too removed from friction and conflict to make sense to people who aren't in that rather enchanted setting. And so, in the process of sifting, I tried to really just take 100, I don't know how many it is, but a series of representative moments, each of which would function as a almost self-contained parable. But I try not to repeat the same kind of material again and again. And one of the things I was trying to do, which you as a discerning reader would have spotted, I'm sure, is that I wanted to give it a forward momentum and a story to carry the reader through the five movements so she sees what's going to happen. But I also wanted almost every passage, as I say, to be out of time and self-sufficient, so and self-contained, so that a reader could pick it up at any point and just read for 2 pages and have something that would she could play with in her mind, and that that doesn't need everything that's behind it and around it and before it. So it's almost like a series of haiku. In that regard. And so, one of the challenges is that probably 97% of the pages I've written there are just me in ecstasy, giving thanks to the universe and so happy to be there. And I realized that it wouldn't be a joy to the mother with two screaming kids navigating rush hour traffic to hear that Pico Iyer is sitting in this beautiful part of California, ecstatic. So those I quickly trimmed, and I tried to keep them to a relative minimum. There are a lot in the first two sections, or the first section to set it up, but then I tried to move into the shadows, challenge myself a lot, challenge my own complacency, upend my assumptions, and have all these voices of friends bringing the reasonable challenges to me that any person might. And then, really, I suppose, thinking that it almost goes without saying that if you're in a silent place, in a silent room, in a radiant setting, with absolute freedom, the happiness and the peace is going to come of its own accord. But what are the challenges? What are the downsides? What are the consequences of that? How do you bring it into the world? And how might that be keeping you far from reality? So I wanted to bring in a lot of darkness and storm and doubt into the book because, doubt is famously the centerpiece of faith.
Um, you mentioned how this book is sort of a companion of Half Known Life, but from you don't mention that ever in Listening to Silence. I don't think that you
No.
say. Okay.
I don't. I don't. The books are always carefully organized in my head, and having a relation to one another, but I always assume that's of little interest to the reader
Right.
and less value to the reader. So um, I thought of the Half Known Life as pretty much an internal book, a meditation about cutting through projections of paradise. And this is finding yourself in paradise and then asking difficult questions about it. But the hope is, of course, that each can exist on its own, but might be even more interesting if you put the two together.
Right. I think early in the book you mentioned how the silence of the hermitage is different from the silence of the
Yes,
mountain or
yes,
the forest.
yes, yes.
So can we talk about what are the different silences?
Yes, that's a very essential question, and that's really the central line of the early pages of the book. The silence in every monastery and every convent in every order I visited across the planet, from Australia to Japan to California, is a positive presence, not just an absence of noise. And it's almost something I think constructed by years of prayer or meditation. So it feels almost tangible, like a transparent glass wall that has been created by the monks or nuns devoting themselves to contemplation. And so it's a very particular kind of release. It's more than quietness and it's more than secludedness. And as I say, presence is probably the best word I could give to it. And I feel it, and I think almost everybody feels it as soon as you arrive in one of those places. I mean, you could say it's the difference between stepping into a church, let's say a church in the West, and stepping into a quiet bookshop. Um, each is very silent, especially a bookshop in the United States, because
Right.
nobody's interested in reading. But it's, I think one is a positive construction, and the other is just an absence of people.
Right. I think you mentioned, of course, how in this book many friends ask you, how has this changed you? And
Mm.
you have a response to that. But how has the silence changed you as a writer and your writing?
I would say that Japan has changed me dramatically as a writer, and I've forged this little life in a two-room apartment in the middle of nowhere in Japan, partly in the light of what I experienced in the Hermitage. So I'd say the Hermitage indirectly has led to admitting more silence into my pages. And I think spending time in that silence has taught me that words are only as rich and deep as the silence that surrounds them and lies under them. And if they're coming from a deep well, you can feel that within the words, and around them. And so, as you saw, there's a lot of white space in these pages, and each little section is kind of elliptical and gnomic and pared down to a maximal extent. So I think that's partly spending time in silence has moved my writing towards that. I hope made it less chattery and a little more resonant. And then living in Japan, the home of the haiku, much more so. And I think of my first book called Video Night in Kathmandu is quite Indian. It's maximalist, and there are 1,000 things in on every page, and it's like stepping into a very crowded room. And now I think of my writing as like stepping into an empty tatami room with only one thing there, and therefore the reader brings her whole attention to it, and I hope finds the whole universe in that one thing, rather than being torn in 100 different directions. So I'd say it's a conspiracy between Japan and the monastery, and Japan and my life in Japan is the result of the monastery.
Uh, do you still like your older books? Or are you wondering who that bloke is?
I love that question. I really like that. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before, but I love that question. I was reflecting a bit on it the other day. So I think the unpleasant answer is that I disown many of my early books, but readers seem to like them, and often I think they like my early books more than my recent ones. So always feel ungracious when someone. I think the second book I wrote, The Lady and the Monk, is the one that I hear the most feedback about and the most appreciation of, even now,
I think that's my
37 years
favorite
after I
too.
wrote it. There we go. And to
Sorry.
this day, no, no, don't worry. And I think that the reader is always right in such a situation. And a book is written for the reader, not for the writer. And so, although I sometimes apologize for being a bratty kid, barely out of his 20s when I wrote that book, clearly I struck something there that strikes a chord in readers, and has continued for 37 years to do so. So, I don't want to disown it. There are passages in it that I disown, and there are other passages I really cherish because I caught something that really did transform my life and opened up a person, a culture, and a lifestyle that I hope will be mine forever. And so that's what we're all seeking in life, and that was a very fundamental moment for me. And I'm glad if that sings through even now. Uh, but insofar as I'm always trying to move forwards, of course, I'm hoping that I'm sloughing off stuff along the way, and that each one is getting at least a little shorter and a little denser, maybe.
Right.
I'm glad. Thank you for enjoying the Lady and the Monk. I'm resigned to the fact that that's the book that people are always going to like the most, and I think for good reason.
I, uh, I mean, I think you talk about this in the book, but maybe we can sort of elaborate on it again. But how does sort of time away from family help with time with family and friends?
Yes, a causal relation, which I never would have imagined when first I went to this remote monastery. And as you probably know, I love being by myself. I'm an only
Mhm.
child. I've devoted myself to being a writer so I can spend all this time alone. When I traveled, it was mostly in order to be alone. And so when I first arrived there, I thought, what heaven, to be in this beautiful setting with not a care in the world and free to do anything I wanted without any responsibilities. And as you say, it took me a while to realize that the solitude was only a gateway to a richer sense of community. And being there, the only justification for being there is what I could bring back to be a better friend or husband or stepfather or son to the people in my life. And when I first, in The Lady and Monk, when I first came to Kyoto, I met a Zen master who saw this wide-eyed romantic kid who didn't really know what a monastery was. And he said, remember, the point of this practice is not in the going away from the world, but in the coming back to it, which I think is a perfect distillation of the monastic commitment in any setting. But I had to learn it the hard way, or because I came to it very slowly and I had to grow up enough to be able to see it. But I've been thinking recently, since the book came out, that if I hadn't gone into that solitude, I probably never would have gotten married. And it's an amazing thing to think that being alone for those long time for those long periods in that little space actually told me that I'm never alone. And as you read, that the people I care about come home to me much more vividly in that undistracted space and when I'm driving down the freeway or going about my busy day. And of course, the monks, when they give themselves to silent contemplation, are only doing so in order to take better care of one another and to serve the world better. And so they're a perfect example. And when I stay with the monks in their enclosure, as I often do, their life is the opposite of busy and calm.
Right.
It's a busy round the clock world and workspace essentially.
You mentioned at the start of this answer that you are an only child. And there's this beautiful quote from your wife in the book when she says that I always
Yes,
thought you were an only child, but you have hundreds of
yes,
brothers.
yes.
So can we talk a little bit about, and also you mentioned about the importance of having that community in the silence, and they both sort of complement each other.
Yes, thank you. And again, you picked out almost the other central line in the whole book. My editor cried actually when she saw that line. I think that's almost my favorite line. So I
Right.
have Hiroko to thank, the heroine of The Lady and the Monk, yet again. Um, but yes, so this Camaldoli's congregation that I stay with uniquely are absolutely committed to both solitude and community. So I think they're the rare monks where they don't all sleep under the same roof. Each one has his own cell. So each is being pushed to the furthest extremes of solitude, but only in order to enrich community. And the amazing thing is that plays out as you saw and as you say, even for those of us who visit. And I think, again, as you read, one of the surprises for me going there to enjoy this time undisturbed and alone is that when I walk along the monastery road and I meet a stranger and we talk for maybe 3 minutes, I quickly trust that stranger in a way I never would if I met a stranger along the streets of California or Mumbai or anywhere else. And it's partly because we're joined not by geography or where we went to college or what we're doing for our job, but by the fact we've both responded to this call to silence. And so we're joined by what is deepest inside us. And the other part of it goes back to your earlier question, and that is that when I exchange a brief conversation with a fellow traveler along that road, everything that person says, maybe 3 sentences, stays with me for a long time because maybe they're the only 3 sentences I hear that day. So there's a lot of white space around them. And I can tell that they're coming from this deep well, and they're coming from the silence in which that person has been sitting. And I think so too when I speak to whoever it is I meet. And so there's a real richness and depth to interactions as well as intimacy that I've never found in the outside world. And one of the things I notice about my monks, if I can call them that, is they never have an or if I ask them something, the answer will probably be two sentences, unlike the answer I'm giving you now. But those two sentences will have everything in them, and a lot for me to reflect upon once I return to my little room. So, being there certainly changes the way one speaks. You asked about how it changes the way I write in terms of silence, but as long as I'm there, it changes the way all of us speak, and therefore actually makes our exchanges much richer than they would be otherwise. And so that makes for a particular kind of community because some of the people I've met along the road, I may have exchanged 5 sentences with in my life, and yet I feel they're some of my closest friends. And there are
Yeah.
other people in the regular world I've exchanged 5 million sentences with and probably don't feel a great kinship with necessarily.
But that's so interesting. So why don't they say Amina? They don't need that pause or they don't need the filler. Why do you think so?
I think it's because of their close acquaintance with silence, and their thoughts come out fully rounded, and there isn't hesitation, and they're bringing out these pebbles from a deep pond, and the pebbles are perfectly rounded, and they're not distracted, and they're not trying to fill spaces, and they're not trying to make small talk necessarily. But it's a singular quality that I recognize in just about all of them, and even in myself and the visitors, as long as we're there. So I think it's the effect of the silence, principally, which kind of polishes clean words that come out of it.
You have this sentence in the book about a monk at heart is the ultimate man of the world.
Mm.
But the world, especially now, seems a bit bonkers, right? And aren't these men sort of a better world?
Aren't these men of a better world? I think if you ask any monk or nun, he or she would say her commitment is to the world. And I think right after that sentence about a monk is an ultimate man of the world, I'm writing about the Dalai Lama, and I say I see him as a doctor in an ER, um, in the emergency room of a hospital. His one commitment in life is tending to the suffering. And he's gathering himself in silence or meditation in order to be of better and more direct use to everyone who comes to him and everyone that he sees as he's walking down the street. So I think monks' um, ultimate destination in that sense is the world, and they gather themselves in seclusion in order to help the world, even if they're never leaving their enclosure. Of course, the Dalai Lama is a rare case because he spends most of his life traveling and literally engaging with the world. But even my Benedictine friends who spend almost all their life in their monastery are essentially helping, dealing with those of us who come buffeted by the bonkers world or having lost direction through the acceleration of the world. And I think that's honestly why there's a greater longing for and fascination with somebody like the Dalai Lama now than ever before in history, precisely because the world is so bonkers. And I write quite a bit about Leonard Cohen in the
Right.
book, and I think the large reason why he is the subject of fascination across the world is people are hungering for a voice of wisdom and kindness and depth, and we don't get so much of that in the public domain, and our leaders aren't often offering that. And so people gravitate towards those that they feel do have some degree of profundity in their lives. And those people, I think, by their nature, are often ones who are spending a lot of time in contemplation, such as Leonard Cohen.
You write very movingly about Leonard Cohen, and I think he seems to um, be very hands-on as well, right? So it's not just him
Mm,
spouting these beautiful sentences, but he's
yeah,
also the
yeah.
man who, will help the ailing monk, etc. Um,
Yes, yes.
what is one of your fondest memories of him?
It speaks exactly to your earlier question because, as you saw and read, the amazing thing was that he'd pretty much erased the entity known as Leonard Cohen when he went to the monastery. He'd just become this anonymous grunt almost, this servant in a tattered black robe tending to anybody who visited. And when I asked him about his career, he looked at me bewildered as if I was referring to somebody else entirely. And when I first met him, I thought, well, that was an affectation or a trick on his part. But that was a reflection of me. And the longer I spent with him, I saw he really had forgotten the public being known as Leonard Cohen. But the other renunciation, and that moved me a lot from him, speaks exactly to your question, because as you say, he was a man of golden words. He was far and away the most articulate writer I've ever met, as people might expect from reading his poems and listening to his songs. But he just spoke he was a wizard with words, and he spoke at an elevation I've almost never encountered, even though I run into other writers. And so my great memory of him is the first time I went to have lunch at his house. And we had a nice lunch in his very simple house with his daughter and maybe his friend of the moment. And he spoke, spellbindingly about the journey of the soul and politics and his life in Greece and his time walking around the beaches of Cuba during the Bay of Pigs and everything from his mesmerizing life. And then at the end of the lunch, he picked up two little folding chairs and he took them out to his tiny front garden, looking out on a small bed of flowers on this quiet residential street. And he sat down and he invited me to sit next to me. And then nothing, and more nothing, not a word. So it might have been 15 or 20 minutes. I was just sitting there, absolutely silent, next to him. And finally, I thought, well, maybe this is a gentle hint. And I said, oh, I should leave you. You must be busy. And he looked up at me, beseeching me, and said, please don't leave. And I realized that he was wise enough to know that silence was the best gift he could share with somebody. It was the best sign of intimacy and friendship, and it meant much more than any words. And he'd probably learnt that through his 5 years in a monastery. And of course, the name his teacher had given him, Jikan, means the silence between two thoughts. So to see this man of ravishing words give himself over so fully to silence was humbling to me and inspiring, and probably one of the great striking things that I encountered with him. And I heard that many people would go and visit him and just sit in silence together and probably feel closer to him in silence than if ever they were exchanging words. And I think in the process of writing this book, I began to think that all of us have a social self, which we need to engage with the world and to take care of our lives. But we all have a silent self, which is where the best in us resides. And Leonard Cohen had done a beautiful job through being a monk of really activating and releasing his silent self. So even, in fact, when he's speaking and giving interviews about his music, I think, as with the monks I'm describing, you could feel the silence from which those words are coming. And he's a good example of somebody who wouldn't be using many ums and ers because he was so profoundly grounded in silence, I think, through his meditation practice, but even more through his monastic practice.
You weren't tempted to include that in the book, this interaction with him?
Did I not include it?
I don't think the sitting in silence one is there.
Really? Ha! That's a notable admission. I somehow almost assumed I had, but huh.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't include it because I might have written about it, spoken about it elsewhere. Um, and yeah, interesting. And maybe I didn't include the fact that his name means the silence between two thoughts. And
Right.
perhaps I thought it was all a distraction. As you know, when I introduce him in the book, I think for 2 pages I don't even use his name, Leonard Cohen,
Mm.
in order to say this is just a typical monk and he's anonymous and we happen to know him as Leonard Cohen, but what you see in this person is probably what you would see in almost every monk and nun. And as you know, one of the things I rejoice in there as a writer who's always wanted to say something different and fresh is my sense that everything I write while I'm in the monastery is probably word for word what each other person staying there at the same time is writing, that we're all speaking with the same voice. And I think Leonard Cohen the same. I mean, my favorite song of his, which is his favorite song of his, is called "If It Be Your Will." This classic prayer, nearly all monosyllables. And the beauty of it is, if you or I picked it up, we wouldn't know if it was Sufi or Hindu or Christian from the 16th century, from the 11th century. And that's wonderful. He's sort of giving voice to some universal longing and prayer.
Right. I think we'd spoken about this when your book, the autumn one came out about how you capitalize time, and
Oh.
and how and why you do that. But is that something you've stopped doing? Because if I'm right, I didn't notice it in this book.
Well, it was a wonderful perception of yours at that time because it was a very significant one, and time has been the god before whom I quail and kneel ever since I was a boy, and I've been more afraid of time, as it were, than anything. And I'm relatively free with my money. I don't care what happens to my money, but I'm very parsimonious with my time. Even since, as I say, since I was a little boy, I would hold on to my time. So even if I'm not capitalizing it now, and I have a different publisher now than during Autumn Light, so they have different house rules, but it's still a huge presence. And of course, the reason that a big reason I spend time in the monastery is that time is dissolved. And then I'm out of time. And every one of the little parables that make up the passages in that book, I intended to be something out of time. Um, and as soon as you go there, you step out of the clock, and I take off my watch, and time becomes immaterial, and you're in this much larger space, and the day lasts 1,000 hours. And I think that's an important part of the liberation that comes there. And actually, again, it's another way in which stepping into the silence of a monastery and convent is different, I think, from stepping into that of a forest or a mountaintop. And as you may know, the Greeks had two words for time: chronos, which refers to the time that belongs to the calendar, and kairos, which refers to sacred time, which speaks for those moments, people call them peak moments, when we're released from time, when you're desperately in love or in your state of wonder, or sometimes you're in your state of terror, or if you have a near-death experience, suddenly the clock is immaterial and you're in some very different frame of reference. And so that is Kairos. And actually, one stays at the monastery, you can actually, one of the trailers in which you can stay is called Kairos, as a way of saying you're sitting in sacred time here. So you don't have to bother about the ticking clock and the
Right.
capitalized time that has always so tyrannized me. A sort of glib way of putting it is that you feel that you're stepping into eternity there and out of the reach of time. And one of the reasons I go there is to be less scared of impermanence.
Mm.
And impermanence is a fact of life. It was at the center of the Autumn Light book, and we can't run away from it. But going to a place that feels as if it exists outside the calendar, surrounded by these tall redwoods that have been there for centuries and a vast ocean that'll be around a lot longer than any of us will, makes the fact of death much less frightening, I would say, because you're brought into this much larger calendar in a sense.
Um,
And
no,
oh,
no,
well
I
done.
haven't.
Okay, good.
I want to ask you again. I mean, of course, this book is so much about the monks that who you meet and how, they were
Yes.
so important to you. But I remember reading something a while back about how you first encountered the monks in your parents' home when you were a child, because they would have visiting monks, if I'm not mistaken, and they were both, I think, professors of religion. So was that some like one of your earliest encounters with people like this, people just of a higher order in a way?
And of course, monks would be the first to say they're not of a higher order and they're just reflections of who we can be if we're so inclined. So the monks who were in our little house in Oxford, England, when I was 3 years old, were Tibetan monks who had been
Mhm.
sent by the Dalai Lama to study in England. And I don't think I registered much about them then, though of course I did gain a lot invisibly by having parents who were philosophers and interested in comparative religion. And my father did take me to visit the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala for the first time when I was a teenager. And even though I couldn't follow the high philosophy he was exchanging with my father, that made an impression on me because he's such a charismatic and kind person. And actually, after we moved to California, some of our closest friends became Hindu Vedanta nuns who live in our hometown. They're all American, but they're very committed to Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and their mother church, as it were, in Calcutta. So I've always enjoyed the company of monks and nuns, but I wouldn't say that that early exposure really, um, really opened a door for me. But I would say differently that I'm one of those people that I've always felt a great pull when I step into a monastery, and maybe it's the silence I'm describing, but I step into any monastery anywhere and I feel at home and I feel, oh, I would so much like to live here. So
I want to ask you about the fire, right? I mean, of course, you've written
please,
about
yes,
it. And again,
yes,
I feel it's so in the news, etc., just, recently.
yes.
And yeah, and maybe it seems like a vague question, but yeah, maybe just can we talk about how fire has actually been such a determining force? And I think in this book it really feels like that, about how the fire is literally something that's threatening their existence in a very real sense.
Very real. So threatening every existence. I think at one point in the book, I say 10 million people in California alone are living in the fire zone. And you probably know that this book is titled A Flame in the United States.
Oh, I didn't
And
know
that
that.
was,
Oh.
yes, it's a fairly significant choice. And I
Yeah.
really, really wanted to be called A Flame because I regard it almost as a poem or a meditation upon fire, the whole book. And both in Britain and in India, they changed the title to Learning from Silence. And I was a little wistful because I think the world is on fire, and fire is serving
But
such a
because
central
that,
function in the book, literally and metaphorically. The very first passage in the book is about fire. I
right.
went to the hermitage because of a fire. The fire is constantly encircling my rebuilt home, and as you say, the monks. And the central question of the book is how do you keep the inner flames alight when the external flames are rewriting our lives? And as it happens, I flew back into Southern California to talk about my book, Aflame, the very day that fires were completely upending so many lives in Los Angeles, just down the road. And for example, I gave a reading 2 weeks after the fires in Los Angeles, and many people in the room had just lost everything in the world to fire. Um, but and so it was very important to me. To have literal fire as well as fire as a way of posing the question, how do we live in a world of uncertainty and impermanence? So, apart from the many instances of fire that I describe through the book, I think in the first paragraph, one monk is described as burning-eyed. I talk about Thomas Merton on Firewatch. Implicitly, I'm thinking of the Buddha's fire sermon that all the world is a burning house, and so that's driving the book. And I was sorry that it wasn't entitled A Flame because, and then as you know, the word A Flame and the title A Flame that I chose came from the Desert Father, whom I cite in the book, who says to a younger monk, if you so wish, you can become all aflame. In other words, the most positive sense, whereby you're absolutely radiant with conviction that nothing can get the better of you. And that's what so many people are hungering for nowadays. And Learning from Silence is a slightly unusual title because I don't feel I have anything to teach. And I'm not sure this is a book about lessons. I think it's a book about experience and confronting the conundrums of the world. Um,
Because both the titles are so different.
I'm glad you say that. I feel that very much.
Yeah.
So in the United States, it's called, which is my principal publisher and home,
Right.
it's called A Flame, and the subtitle is Learning from Silence. And independently, as I say, my editor in London and my editor in India said, "Oh, we like Learning from Silence, and I think that will speak to people." Maybe because I brought out that little TED book called The Art of
Mhm.
Stillness, which many people read. They thought this would be a kind of sequel to it. But to me, as a writer, A Flame is the heart of the book, just as you intuited perfectly.
Right. Because I mean, lessons from learning from silence it is a bit didactic, right? And this book is not that, I think so.
Thank you. Thank you. No, if there's one thing I don't want to write, it's a didactic book. I'm not in a position to, I'm not a teacher or a wise person. I'm just somebody kind of stumbling through his life. So, yeah, I don't feel I have anything to transmit other than what I witness and have experienced. No,
When
so
you were sorry.
I still really like the title of Flame, as you could tell. And I think if you have that on the cover, as you're reading the book, many a scene will sort of resonate
Mm.
differently, and you'll see how fire is existing on about six different levels, maybe through the book.
When you were speaking just in the last answer, and you spoke about that quote when you are all aflame, you also write
Yes,
very movingly about that Vietnamese monk and when he burnt
yes, yes.
himself. So again, since we I didn't know the original title was A Flame, but was fire actually sort of the moving force through this book in a way?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yes. Um, very much. Yes, as you said, because you've been kind enough to read so many of my other books, it's been a moving force through many of my books. And in this book, I really had the notion of fire and water because you're looking out over the ocean, which is tremendously soothing and calming. And yet, as you said, this place in a remote wilderness is permanently encircled by flames, and the monks are constantly having to run for their lives, as you read several times in this book. So, yes, and that's why, to go back to almost your first question, how I distilled 4,000 pages into 200 was, structure, I think, is the most important thing in creating any book. And so it was really important for me to begin with fire and to begin with two monks looking at this charred landscape, but not with regret or mourning, but just this is the reality that we have to live with. And as I say later in the book, in the hills of California, you quickly learn that pine trees and meadows and manzanita can't live without fire. The nature depends on it to clear out the overgrowth and to make room for animals, and it's part of the cycle of nature that's been there forever. So if you can't live without fire, how do you live with fire? But I think insofar as it was hard to create a kind of single image to carry one through a scatter of very different scenes, fire was definitely the one. And that's why it seems gratuitously I'll bring in fires every now and then because it's meant to be that unifying agent. So thank you for registering that.
No, it just reminds me of I remember a friend telling me how there's an Adivasi saying, which is a hillside needs a fire like a human needs a haircut.
Yeah, perfect.
I guess.
Yeah, yes. And of course, in India, I mean, I think so many of the great religious rites turn on fire. And, my last book ended in Varanasi, the center of fire in some ways. So it's a really essential element in every
Right.
religion, I think.
Wonderful. I think I am good. Is there anything else you'd like to
No,
add?
I mean it's
Nothing.
just it's honestly such a gift and a luxury to talk with you, both because we've
Thank
talked
you.
before and because I know that you read so closely and because you're the first interviewer, as I said, in India who's read my book before. So thank you very much. And I was trying hard as we were speaking to sort of give you material that's not going to appear elsewhere in India.
Wonderful.
So there's some of this, obviously, there's some overlap, but you so wonderfully alighted on the really pivotal moments.
No, thank
I
you. It's
really
always such a
appreciate
pleasure. I enjoy talking to
um,
you about that.
thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thank you
Bye
so much.
bye.
Thanks. Bye.